In our last Ottoman video, you saw the empire's hidden practices, but the sultans themselves kept even darker secrets that make everything else look like a children's story. What you're about to discover comes from documented historical records that reveal how absolute power created a system of sexual exploitation so systematic, so calculated, that it operated for over 6 centuries. These weren't random acts of cruelty, but carefully designed institutions that turned human beings into commodities for imperial pleasure. But before we start, if you like the forgotten dark history, consider subscribing and commenting where you're watching from. It helps us a lot to make more videos like these. Now back to the video. The Topkapi Palace harem wasn't the luxurious paradise depicted in Hollywood fantasies. It was the largest institutionalized system of sexual slavery in human history, requiring 1,200 servants just to maintain its operations. Behind those ornate walls lived up to 400 women at any given time, but here's what most people don't realize. These weren't willing participants in some romantic Oriental dream. They were captured slaves, kidnapped girls, and human gifts presented to the Sultan like expensive jewelry. The procurement methods reveal the industrial scale of this horror. Slave girls were captured during military campaigns, purchased from neighboring territories, or recruited through systematic kidnapping operations that targeted Christian populations across the Balkans, Caucasus, and Africa. Most arrived as children, some as young as 7 years old, torn from their families and transported hundreds of miles to serve the Sultan's sexual appetite. The age range wasn't accidental. Young girls could be molded, their personalities shaped to serve imperial desires. They learned Turkish, converted to Islam, and received training in music, dance, and intimate arts. But this wasn't education, it was programming. These children were being systematically prepared for sexual servitude under the guise of cultural refinement. The hierarchy within the harem created a hellscape of competition and cruelty. New arrivals faced treatment that would make prison guards blush. Veteran concubines, desperate to maintain their precarious positions, often brutalized newcomers to establish dominance. The goal wasn't sisterhood or mutual support, it was survival through the systematic destruction of potential rivals. At the bottom of this pyramid sat the newest girls, treated like property by women who had once occupied the same position. The psychological damage was intentional. Breaking down individual identity made resistance impossible, while creating desperate competition that prevented organized rebellion. Every woman became both victim and perpetrator in a system designed to consume human dignity. The Sultan's sexual access wasn't limited by marriage law or personal preference. While Islamic tradition technically allowed 4 wives, Ottoman sultans maintained unlimited concubines. The scope defied comprehension. From the 16th century onward, no Ottoman sultan married a free woman. Every single intimate relationship involved enslaved women who had no legal right to refuse sexual advances. The mechanics of this system reveal its calculated cruelty. Turkish sultans were permitted 4 official wives and as many concubines as their desires demanded. But the real horror lay in the selection process. The Sultan could summon any woman from the harem at any time, for any purpose. Refusal meant death. Compliance meant survival, at least temporarily. The most disturbing aspect wasn't the sexual exploitation itself, but the bureaucratic efficiency with which it operated. Records were kept documenting each woman's origins, physical characteristics, and reproductive history. The harem functioned like a medieval human resources department, cataloguing women like inventory in a warehouse. The one-son rule represents perhaps the most systematically cruel aspect of Ottoman reproductive control. This wasn't about family planning or managing succession. It was about reducing women to biological functions while maintaining absolute control over their bodies and reproductive choices. Here's how the horror unfolded. A concubine maintained the Sultan's sexual attention until she produced a male heir. The moment she gave birth to a son, her intimate relationship with the Sultan ended permanently. No exceptions, no appeals, no consideration for her feelings or desires. She had served her biological function and became sexually irrelevant. But the system's cruelty extended far beyond simple abandonment. If a concubine failed to become pregnant within 2 months of sexual relationship with the Sultan, she faced immediate marriage to one of his military officers. This wasn't kindness or second chances, it was disposal. Women who couldn't fulfill their reproductive function were discarded like defective machinery. The psychological impact on these women was devastating and intentional. They lived in constant terror, knowing their entire future depended on biological processes beyond their control. Pregnancy meant security, but sexual isolation. Failure to conceive meant exile from the palace and marriage to strangers. Success in producing daughters meant continued vulnerability, as only male children provided protection. The Sultan maintained multiple sexual relationships simultaneously, rotating between different concubines based on his desires and their reproductive status. Women who had recently given birth were immediately replaced by new selections from the harem population. The system ensured constant availability of fertile women while preventing any single concubine from developing meaningful influence through extended intimate contact. This reproductive control extended to methods that would shock modern medical professionals. Historical accounts suggest sultans employed various forms of birth control to prevent additional pregnancies from women who had already produced sons. These methods ranged from herbal concoctions to more invasive procedures that prioritized imperial convenience over women's health or survival. The system created a horrifying calculation for enslaved women. Pregnancy meant temporary safety but permanent sexual rejection. Multiple pregnancies increased their chances of producing the crucial male heir, but also increased their risk of death from childbirth complications. Many women faced the impossible choice between risking death through repeated pregnancies or accepting sexual disposal after failing to conceive. The one-son rule also served strategic political purposes that reveal the calculated nature of Ottoman sexual exploitation. By preventing concubines from producing multiple male heirs, the system reduced potential succession disputes, while maintaining clear lines of imperial authority. Each woman could only contribute one potential heir to the dynasty, preventing the development of powerful maternal factions within the palace. The enforcement of this rule required constant surveillance and control over women's bodies that extended far beyond the bedroom. Palace physicians monitored menstrual cycles, documented pregnancies, and reported reproductive status directly to imperial administrators. Women's most intimate biological functions became matters of state security and bureaucratic record-keeping. But the reproductive control was just the beginning of a system that would make modern human rights advocates physically ill. The fratricide law that governed succession created a culture of institutionalized mass murder that turned family relationships into death sentences. And when sultans like Ibrahim the Mad combined unlimited sexual access with paranoid delusions, the results were atrocities that defy comprehension. The foundation had been laid for centuries of systematic sexual exploitation, but the individual sultans who wielded this power would prove that absolute authority combined with sexual deviance could create monsters whose actions still shock historians today. What they did with this system of human ownership would reveal depths of cruelty that make everything we've covered so far look like mercy. The fratricide law represents the most systematically horrifying practice in Ottoman dynasty history, institutionalizing mass murder within the royal family itself. This wasn't some ancient barbaric custom that evolved naturally. It was deliberate policy, codified into law by Mehmed the Conqueror, who formalized brother killing as a legal requirement for new sultans. The law's justification reveals the twisted logic of absolute power. According to the official decree, Any Ottoman prince ascending the throne had the legal right and moral obligation to execute all his male siblings. This wasn't presented as cruelty, but as necessary statecraft designed to prevent civil wars and succession disputes. The empire's stability mattered more than human lives, even royal ones. The scale of these killings could be staggering. When Mehmed III became sultan in 1595, he immediately ordered the execution of 19 brothers. 19 men, all members of the royal family, strangled with silk cords in a single day because their continued existence threatened imperial unity. These weren't enemies or rebels. They were sons of the same father, raised in the same palace, murdered for the crime of being born male. The method of execution was deliberately ritualized to maintain the fiction of dignity while ensuring complete elimination of threats. Royal princes were strangled with silk bowstrings by deaf-mute executioners who couldn't hear their final words or pleas for mercy. The silk represented respect for royal blood, while the deaf-mute executioners prevented any last-minute appeals from reaching sympathetic ears. The psychological impact on surviving family members was devastating and intentional. Mothers watched their sons kill their other sons, knowing that speaking against the fratricide meant their own death. Wives of executed princes became widows overnight, their children orphaned by imperial decree. The trauma rippled through generations, creating a royal family where love was dangerous and family bonds were potential death sentences. The law created a culture of terror that extended far beyond the immediate succession crisis. Princes grew up knowing that their brothers were their potential executioners, while simultaneously understanding that their own survival might depend on murdering the people closest to them. Childhood games became rehearsals for future fratricide, and brotherly affection became a luxury that could prove fatal. But even this systematic family murder pales compared to the sexual depravity of individual sultans who wielded unlimited power over human lives. Ibrahim the Mad represents the absolute nadir of Ottoman sexual violence, a ruler whose combination of unlimited access and psychological instability created one of history's most prolific sexual predators. Ibrahim's sexual behavior transcended mere exploitation and entered the realm of systematic rape as imperial policy. His agents scoured Constantinople, identifying attractive women for forced recruitment into his personal harem. Marriage proposals from Ibrahim weren't requests. They were commands backed by imperial authority and enforced through violence. The case of the Grand Mufti's daughter reveals how no woman, regardless of social status or family protection, was safe from Ibrahim's predation. When the Grand Mufti refused Ibrahim's marriage proposal for his daughter, understanding the Sultan's reputation, Ibrahim's response was swift and brutal. He ordered the girl seized and brought to the palace, where he raped her repeatedly for days before returning her to her father as a demonstration of absolute power. This wasn't passion or romance, it was calculated psychological warfare designed to break the will of potential opponents while satisfying Ibrahim's compulsive sexual appetites. The message was clear to every father in the empire. Your daughters exist at the Sultan's pleasure, and religious authority means nothing when confronted with imperial desire. Ibrahim's treatment of his official harem reveals the industrial scale of his sexual violence. Historical accounts describe how he would line up virgin concubines in the palace gardens, moving from one to the next like a predator working through available prey. The dehumanization was complete and intentional. These women weren't individuals with names, feelings, or rights. They were interchangeable objects for imperial consumption. The mirror-lined rooms where Ibrahim conducted his orgies represent the ultimate expression of narcissistic sexual violence. He transformed intimate encounters into theatrical performances where his own reflection multiplied infinitely, turning sex into a monument to his own power and appetite. The women involved were reduced to props in elaborate sexual theatre, designed to glorify the Sultan's virility and dominance. The numbers associated with Ibrahim's sexual behavior reveal the systematic nature of his exploitation. He allegedly maintained intimate relations with 24 different concubines in a single day, treating sex like a military campaign with quotas to meet and territories to conquer. Over 7 years, his concubines bore him 18 children, evidence of the relentless sexual demands he placed on the women under his control. But Ibrahim's paranoia would ultimately lead to the most horrific mass murder in harem history, an atrocity so shocking that even contemporary Ottoman chroniclers struggled to document it fully. The mass drowning of his entire harem represents the ultimate demonstration of how completely powerless women were in the Ottoman system. The incident began with manipulation and jealousy, classic elements of harem politics that Ibrahim's unstable mind transformed into mass murder. Sivakar Sultan, one of his favoured concubines, allegedly informed him that another woman in the harem had been compromised by an outsider. She provided no names, no evidence, just a whispered accusation that fed Ibrahim's paranoid delusions about betrayal and sexual infidelity. Ibrahim's response reveals the depth of his psychological instability and the unlimited nature of his power over women's lives. He demanded information about this mysterious traitor, conducting interrogations and investigations that yielded no evidence because no crime had actually occurred. But the lack of proof didn't matter to a sultan whose word was absolute law and whose paranoia had consumed his capacity for rational thought. When no traitor emerged despite days of investigation, Ibrahim made a decision that still shocks historians centuries later. He ordered the execution of his entire harem, 280 women who had committed no crime except existing in the same space where an unsubstantiated accusation had been made. The method of execution was designed for maximum efficiency and minimum imperial inconvenience. Each woman was tied in a weighted sack and thrown into the Bosphorus Strait to drown, like unwanted cargo. No trials, no individual examinations, no consideration for innocence or guilt. Just mass murder based on the paranoid suspicions of an absolute ruler who viewed women as disposable property. The execution was carried out with bureaucratic efficiency that makes modern genocides look disorganized. Palace guards methodically worked through the harem quarters, dragging terrified women from their rooms, while deaf-mute executioners prepared the weighted sacks that would serve as their coffins. The women knew exactly what was happening, their screams echoing through corridors that had witnessed centuries of suffering, but nothing quite like this systematic elimination of an entire population. Only one woman survived this maritime massacre, and her survival reveals the random nature of Ibrahim's justice. She managed to tear open her sack underwater and swim to shore, where she was discovered by fishermen who initially thought they were witnessing a supernatural event. Her testimony provides the only first-hand account of what it felt like to be murdered en masse by imperial decree, describing the terror of drowning while knowing that hundreds of other women were sharing the same fate. The aftermath of this atrocity demonstrates how thoroughly the Ottoman system had normalized violence against women. There were no investigations, no punishments for those who carried out the murders, no official records documenting the names or origins of the victims. 280 human beings simply vanished from history, their deaths treated as a minor administrative matter in the broader scope of imperial governance. Ibrahim's eventual deposition and execution came not because of his treatment of women, but because his erratic behavior threatened the empire's military effectiveness. The systematic rape, the mass drowning, the sexual violence that terrorized an entire city. None of these crimes motivated his removal from power. Only when his madness began affecting tax collection and military campaigns did the imperial system finally turn against him. But Ibrahim wasn't an aberration. He was the logical conclusion of a system that granted unlimited sexual access, combined with absolute power over human lives. Other sultans like Murad IV demonstrated how sexual dysfunction and political authority could create monsters who terrorized entire populations through gendered violence. Murad's relationship with women reveals how childhood trauma and unlimited power could transform sexual desire into systematic murder. His mother's attempts to manipulate his sexuality by surrounding him only with young boys while keeping him away from women created psychological damage that manifested in extreme violence against the female population of Constantinople. The results were horrifying and public. Murad would steal out of the palace at midnight, armed with his sword, and roam the streets killing any woman he encountered. His violence was specifically targeted at females, using archery practice as an excuse to murder women he saw while riding through the city. This wasn't private madness confined to palace walls. It was public terrorism that turned the empire's capital into a hunting ground where women faced death for the crime of existing in public spaces. The sexual exploitation extended beyond the harem through systems that targeted male children with equal brutality. The Ottoman practice of recruiting young boys as pages created another layer of institutional sexual abuse that operated parallel to the harem system. These children, captured during military campaigns or purchased through slave markets, faced sexual exploitation disguised as education and career advancement. The Köçek dancers represent perhaps the most systematic example of child sexual exploitation in Ottoman culture. Boys as young as 7 were trained in feminine dancing and sexual performance, then displayed in taverns where adult men would fight each other for the opportunity to sexually assault these children. The violence associated with these performances was so extreme that audiences would literally kill each other, competing for access to rape prepubescent boys. By 1837, the situation had become so chaotic that authorities banned Köçek performances entirely, not because they recognized the sexual exploitation of children, but because the violence among customers was disrupting public order. The welfare of the children being systematically abused never factored into the decision-making process. The eunuch system provided the administrative backbone for all these forms of sexual exploitation, creating a class of mutilated men whose castration served the empire's need for trustworthy harem guardians. These weren't volunteers who chose castration as a career path. They were prisoners of war and enslaved children who were surgically mutilated before puberty to serve imperial sexual politics. The procurement process reveals the international nature of this systematic mutilation. White eunuchs came from conquered Christian territories in the Caucasus, Georgia, Armenia, Hungary, Slovenia, and Germany. The castration itself was performed by Christian and Jewish slave traders because Islamic law prohibited Muslims from conducting the procedure while permitting them to purchase and use the resulting eunuchs. As late as 1903, the Ottoman court maintained 194 eunuchs, with 35 holding senior administrative positions that governed the empire's sexual exploitation systems. These mutilated men spent their entire lives managing institutions designed to facilitate the rape and abuse of others, creating a bureaucracy of sexual violence that operated with the efficiency of any government department. The true scope of Ottoman sexual practices reveals a civilization that systematically weaponized human sexuality to maintain political control while satisfying the personal appetites of absolute rulers. This wasn't ancient barbarism that evolved naturally over time. It was deliberate policy designed by intelligent administrators who understood exactly what they were creating and maintained it for over 6 centuries. The documentation survives in Ottoman archives, eyewitness accounts from foreign diplomats, and archaeological evidence that confirms the worst historical testimonies. These practices shaped not just the Ottoman Empire, but influenced concepts of power and sexuality that spread across 3 continents and continue to impact modern geopolitics. The legacy of these systems extends far beyond historical curiosity. The normalization of sexual violence as a tool of political control, the systematic dehumanization of women and children, the bureaucratization of rape and murder. All of these elements establish patterns of abuse that echo through modern human trafficking, sexual slavery, and authoritarian control mechanisms that persist today. Understanding this history isn't about attacking any particular culture or religion. It's about recognizing how absolute power combined with systematic dehumanization can create institutions of suffering that operate for centuries while presenting themselves as normal aspects of civilization. The Ottoman sexual practices represent one of history's most comprehensive examples of how authority structures can be designed specifically to facilitate and perpetuate sexual violence on an industrial scale. The survivors of these systems left no monuments, no museums, no descendants to preserve their memory. Like so many victims of systematic sexual violence throughout history, they were consumed by the very institutions designed to exploit them, their suffering documented only in the administrative records of their oppressors and the horrified testimonies of foreign observers. This is the hidden history they don't teach in schools, the systematic sexual violence that shaped empires and influenced the development of entire regions. The Ottoman Sultans created a template for sexual exploitation that would be studied and replicated by authoritarian systems for centuries to come, proving that the most dangerous combination in human history isn't military might or economic power, but unlimited authority over other human beings combined with the systematic removal of moral constraints. The next time you hear about historical harems or Ottoman luxury, remember what actually happened behind those ornate walls. Remember the children stolen from their families, the women drowned for imaginary crimes, the boys mutilated to serve imperial convenience, and the centuries of systematic sexual violence that operated under the banner of civilization and divine authority. Human dignity requires constant vigilance because the capacity for systematic evil never disappears. It just changes costumes and updates its justifications while pursuing the same fundamental goal: the complete dehumanization of the vulnerable in service to the powerful.